Page 346, Part 25. Optimism and hope are the result of a neutral, positive, equalized thinking, and thereby also of an affirming consciousness, from which the personality is also formed. Naturally, there are an enormous number of human beings, negativists, pessimists, and others, who must be classified as constant protesters and who reject and contest everything. It is characteristic of these human beings to negate everything which sounds like hope, and to portray the neutral, positive, equalized, progressive, healthy, and optimistic thinking as an all too bright view of the life. They are of the stupid and irrational view that a neutral, positive, equalized thought principle is directed at simply negating everything negative, whereby pain, worry, grief, errors, and disadvantageous things, and so forth, are no longer supposed to appear, or are no longer supposed to be taken into consideration. On the one hand, this view is held as a result of misunderstanding, but on the other hand, also because the optimism and the hope and so forth are wrongly interpreted. As has already been explained in this text, the truth is that the neutral, positive, equalized thought pattern is formed such that both the positive as well as the negative facts of a matter are taken into consideration and processed, and therefore negative things and errors are also included, which must be thoroughly investigated, processed, put right, and resolved. However, in order to really be able to think and work in this form, it is necessary that the human being is effectively a realist in his or her neutral, positive, equalized thinking, in order to recognize the entire extent of the actual facts of a matter and the truth. And only when a human being is a real realist is he or she able to clearly and unambiguously actually recognize all difficulties and errors and so forth, a fact which does not apply to the pessimist and negative thinker, because he or she truthfully sees everything as black can be, or at least as gray can be. The negative thinker always sees all difficulties and problems such that they are like a kind of power of evil which wants to force him or her down in order to finally finish him or her off. In contrast to that, the positive thinker always sees factors in the difficulties and problems and so forth which he or she can overcome in order to thereby be serviceable in every regard pertaining to the achievement of a higher level of the evolution. He or she never sees in them any elements of being pulled down and depressed. Rather, he or she always looks beyond them, full of expectation of overcoming and mastering the existing difficulties and problems, and so forth, by means of creative and constructive solutions. In other words, he or she looks into the future beyond everything concerning errors, problems, and difficulties, and sees the solutions to everything before terrible things are even able to scratch him or her. A human being who is healthy and correct, neutral, positive, equalized, and progressive in his or her thoughts, gains, in any case, a more comprehensive and deeper insight into the life than is the case with the negative thinker, who regards everything only superficially, and as a rule, only just from the negating and bad side. A human being with a good, right, healthy, and positive thinking always sees everything clearly and in a neutral form, and uses everything in order to work with it and make something from it, as well as to gain evolutive advantage from it. Put briefly, he or she is not the type of human being who allows himself or herself to be brought down, and who gives up when he or she encounters something which challenges him or her to a fight. And regardless of how difficult and terrible situations and so forth may be, he or she fights on in order to work his or her way out of the toughest and most hopeless situations, and indeed with a positive result. However, now and then it may certainly be the case that this does not completely succeed. For example, if outside influences, which cannot be influenced, play a role for him or her. But then at least there is always the satisfaction that in spite of everything, the best possible thing was undertaken, and in fact, everything in his or her power. And this certainly is thereby very much more than can ever be the case with a negative thinker, because, in his or her pessimism and negating, he or she undertakes absolutely no realistic attempts at all to change a situation, get a grip on it, and to make something positive out of it. With the positive thinker and optimist, in contrast to the negative thinker, it is also the case that, from the corresponding situation, he or she gains much that is valuable in regard to his or her independence, psyche, and progress in every regard, and in regard to his or her consciousness, personality, character, and morality, and so forth. Therefore, for the positive thinker, there is no situation, no occurrence, and also nothing else from which he or she would not draw evolutive benefit, because everything in him or her is directed such that the way which best promises success is always searched for and taken, in the constant hope that everything may certainly succeed. The hope is also a part of the consciousness, and is tended and nurtured in thoughts. Consequently, it is also equipped with an enormous might. However, hope must always be neutral positive equalized, which means that it is only useful when it carries within it a progressive determination which is directed at a well thought out, good, right, healthy, and therefore positive Ziel, which was created from an idea into an ideal, an imagination, and striving. But if hope is only connected with purely idea-based wishes or desires, then it has no determining value and is extinguished in the winds of speculative ideas, which are either likewise extinguished or are fully expressed in unreal, harmful, and negative kind and wise, and contain no form of evolutive value. Hope is a form of expectation which is directed at something quite definite, therefore at a set Ziel, which was worked out from an idea as an ideal or imagination, and so forth. An evolutive hope, which is constructed in this way, therefore represents an attitude of expectation, which is brought to fruition through the might of the thoughts, when a Ziel is striven for which has assumed an imaginary form based on ideals. Therefore, hope, that is to say, expectation in this form, is a necessity which is always characteristic of the positive thinker and optimist, and which is directed such that the striving towards the Ziel, and for that which is higher, continues to be driven onward. Thus, the hope is therefore also a motivator of the forward progress, because, as a result of the hope, the very achievement of the Ziel is expected. But hope is also connected with joy. Consequently, it can also be called joyful expectation, whereby, however, the ultimate value of the term has not yet been mentioned and explained, because in the deepest sense of the word, hope conceals in itself this actual value. Hope is a firm confidence that the set Ziel, once worked out, will actually be reached and fulfilled. Therefore, in no wise does hope have something to do with the idea-based wishful thinking, which is directed at maintaining belief wishes to which the human being clings, believing that they come to fruition. Therefore, belief wishes have nothing to do with the real and evolutive hope, that is to say, expectation and confidence, which in the real sense of the term must actually be described as the certainty that the striven-for zeal will actually be achieved. If the hope, that is to say, expectation and confidence, is not seen, recognized, and accepted in this form, rather it is exercised in belief-based contexts, or in another unreal mode, then it is able to bring about danger, which can be of very many different kinds. Thus, a form of false hope is able to destroy the obligations of the present and of the life, whereby not only material disadvantages, rather, first of all, psychical or even consciousness-based harm can arise, which naturally and inevitably leads to a stagnation of every form of one's personal development, taking possession of the human being. The human being must always be clearly conscious of hope, expectation, confidence, and certainty in correct, healthy, positive, and evolutive form, so that he or she does not fall prey to belief wishes, which are in every form always unreal, harmful in the long term, as well as disadvantageous and damaging, and indeed also when that is not recognized at first glance. In every case, one's conscious and unconscious evolution is impaired, which means that the human being does not, in his or her present life, achieve the quota of his or her evolutive zeal, and he or she perhaps even devolves, and is again confronted in his or her next life with his or her missed evolution, which must then be made up for, whereby the efforts concerning this, however, will certainly then be greater and more strenuous. Life means achievement, evolving and fulfilling responsibility in the frame of the creational laws and recommendations. But to that end, hope and optimism are also necessary, along with many other values. Optimism, in and of itself, is a miraculous medicine for the consciousness, as well as for the psyche and the body. Contained within the optimism is the hope, therefore, the expectation, the confidence, and the certainty. And the hope has a quite special value, which is also of a self-psychotherapeutic nature. Through the might of the thoughts, hope affects the world of feeling and the world of the psyche, which also exercise a certain influence on one's physical health and life power, whereby this influence must not be underestimated. And it is also the hope, that is to say, the confidence and the certainty, which allows the positive thinker to still see, in neutral equalized form, a possibility in everything, even in the current time when so much disaster and so many terrible things govern the world, in order to form that which is progressive, creative, and constructive from it, regardless of how dark and hopeless everything may appear. But unfortunately, the fact is that most of today's human beings no longer ever see these possibilities, and above all, they are also not on the lookout for them. This is not based on an unfortunate predisposition of human nature, rather solely on the fact that the human being presumes to think that he himself or she herself is that creational, universal, consciousness-based power and greatness which has created the life from scratch. Therefore, the human being has a wrong understanding of the genesis and he or she believes himself or herself to be the fundamental creational power in the universal creational sense, because unfortunately, he or she has already long removed himself or herself from the truth that he or she is a created creation of the creation, that is to say, a created creation of the universal consciousness itself, and ought to fundamentally follow and fulfill the creational natural laws and recommendations. But from the knowledge that he or she, the human being, is equipped by creation with his or her own will and discretion in relation to everything and anything that he or she wants to devise and do, and is therefore absolutely free in his or her entire thinking, feeling, and action, and so forth, to make any decisions and to carry out acts and deeds, and so forth, he or she thinks himself or herself above creation and its laws and recommendations. Consequently, he or she overrides them and lives according to self-created laws and recommendations. However, these are of such a kind that the human being can allow himself or herself and acquire all that which brings him or her purely worldly pleasure and joy and so forth, through which he or she can delight in everything which satisfies his or her desires. And since he or she is able to do that without being obviously brought to account through the creational laws and recommendations, he or she feels himself or herself above the creation, and does not concern himself or herself in any wise with its universal guidelines, which determine the life and the evolution in every detail. Therefore, the human being lives only his or her pleasures and joys, and where possible, dodges every responsibility and the bearing and fulfillment of it. And if the human being has a pang of conscience for some reason or other, because he or she knows, in his or her inner nature, about the unrightness of his or her leading and forming of his or her life, and so forth, then he or she believes he or she can free himself or herself from his or her burden by believing in the imaginary dear God, and can ask him or his or her subordinates for forgiveness, and so forth, through prayers and alms for the poor box, or for some help, organization, or other. This is an erroneous, terrible thing which is practiced by religions and sects right around the world, whereby the human being is not only misguided, rather, to the worst degree, he or she is also held far from and kept from the creational natural obligation of the fulfillment of evolution. Through this, there is also an emergence of negativism and pessimism, which, particularly in today's world, increasingly take hold and create thought patterns which are so unhealthy, wrong, and negative that one's feelings and psyche, and often even one's consciousness, become sick and miserable. In this form, human beings become gloomy thinkers, and even true artists of gloominess, who manage to conjure up the most negative of all that which is negative, to then wonder why they have not seen any possibilities of something better and positive. They do not understand the sense of this. The human being must think neutral, positive, equalized, in order to have the same kind of feelings and a psyche of the same direction, in order to always be on the lookout in this form for possibilities which allow him or her to strive for that which is higher, better, and evolutive. Possibilities are not simply possibilities, because on one hand, they form a factor which serves in coping with things and situations and so forth, whereby solutions and success therefore emerge from the possibilities. But then there are still the other kind of possibilities, and indeed those whereby a problem, a situation, or simply a given fact, and so forth, is seen as a possibility of a way arising or existing which can be recognized, taken, and mastered in order to achieve a new and progressive result.